You have probably already watched dozens of epic films and series about the time of Christ, and if you close your eyes right now, I bet you can picture the clothes of that era. People walking through Jerusalem, wearing simple tunics, poorly cut rags tied with pieces of rope, or those perfect outfits with straight seams that look like they came straight out of a modern department store. But what if I told you that almost everything Hollywood taught you about the wardrobe of the ancient world is absolutely wrong? Here is the great truth, the fact that most people do not know. In the 1st century, in Jerusalem, scissors were practically the enemy of fashion. Nobody took a large piece of cloth, laid it on a table, cut out the shape of a shirt, and then sewed the parts together. Doing that would have been considered an unforgivable waste, a true financial act of madness. The clothes of the time of Christ were not sewn like ours. They were actually designed and built, thread by thread, in the exact shape of the body, as if printed in 3 dimensions. Forget the image of the primitive man wearing rags at random. What existed on the dusty streets of ancient Jerusalem was a textile engineering so brilliant, a manual craft so complex and time-consuming, that a single garment was treated as a true family treasure. A tunic was worth so much that it was left as inheritance and wills, used as currency, and considered one of the most valuable possessions a human being could own in their entire life. If you lost your cloak, you were not simply cold. You were losing your home and your identity. Prepare yourself for a journey through time. We are going to discover how ordinary men and women, without electricity and without sewing machines, managed to create garments that lasted decades and that told the story of who they were through nothing but the color and the fall of the threads. The true history of clothing in the time of Christ is fascinating and will completely change the way you look at what you are wearing right now. To understand the importance of what people wore in 1st century Judea, we need to look at our own wardrobes. Today, we live in the age of fast fashion, quick and disposable. If you need a new t-shirt, just open an app, and in a few days the item arrives at your door for a very low price. If it tears, you throw it away and buy another. Our clothes are made by enormous machines producing thousands of pieces per minute. They lost all connection to the creation process of what covers us. Come back in time with me. Imagine we are in the year 30 of our era, walking the stone streets of Jerusalem. The sun burns without mercy. The noise of merchants echoes, and desert dust floats in the air. In Tisward, discarding a garment would have been considered an absurdity. In that time, slow fashion was the only reality possible, making a single tunic, from harvesting the raw material to wearing the finished piece, cool to take a full year of hard work. There were no factories. The factory was the home itself, the calloused hands of the women and men who understood that covering the body was a battle. When a 1st century Jew put on a clean woven tunic, that garment carried the weight of hundreds of hours of sweat. A piece of clothing was not a consumer item. It was a real estate investment, almost like buying a plot of land. That is why, when we read in historical records that people tore their own garments in moments of grief, it carried a devastating weight. Tearing your garment was not a theatrical gesture. It was the voluntary destruction of months of work. Before the fabric existed, before the thread existed, there was the earth and the animals. In the land of Israel, the wardrobe was born from 2 sources: the sheep grazing on rocky hills and the green stalks growing near the water. We speak of wool and linen, the foundation of everything worn by everyone, from the Galilean peasant to the high priest. In the great temple of Jerusalem, wool was the bread and butter of ancient dress. Once a year in spring, The great shearing took place, a moment of celebration and exhausting work. The men cut the thick wool from the animals, which came loaded with dirt, thorns, and a natural grease called lanolin. This raw wool had to be washed in streams, beaten on rocks to remove the filth, and spread in the blazing sun to dry. After drying, a meticulous process called carding began. Using tools that looked like large combs, people untangled the wool, separated the fibers, removed the last knots, and aligned the threads until they were as soft as clouds. Only then was the fluffy mountain ready to become thread. Wool was ideal for the region's climate, keeping the body warm on freezing nights and protecting against the wind. On the other side was linen, extracted from a blue-flowered plant. The process of turning linen into clothing looked like botanical torture. The stalks were harvested, bundled, and left to soak in water for weeks, a process called retting, which caused the outer shell of the plant to rot. The smell was terrible. After the outer shell rotted, the stalks were dried, crushed, and beaten until only the long, strong internal fibers remained. Linen was the material of summer, cool, breathable, and extremely durable. Interestingly, there was a strict rule in Jewish culture known as the Law of Shabbat. It was strictly forbidden to mix wool and linen in the same garment. This rule was not about fashion. It was about obedience, reminding the people to maintain sacred distinctions. The purity of materials was a representation of spiritual purity. So the shepherd and the grower worked hard, but their materials followed parallel paths. Here we arrive at the beating heart of clothing production in the ancient world, a heart that beat to the rhythm of women's hands. If we were to build a monument to honor the survival of ancient humanity, it should not be a sword, but a spindle and a distaff. Spinning was the most time-consuming, repetitive, and endless work in human history. Think about this. To make a simple knee-length tunic, you needed kilometers of thread, and that thread did not appear by magic. It had to be twisted, centimeter by centimeter, by the skilled hands of women. The image in our heads is of that spinning wheel, immortalized in fairy tales. But erase that from your mind. The spinning wheel would not be invented until the Middle Ages long. After the time of Christ, in the 1st century in Jerusalem, the equipment was absurdly simple and ingenious. A long piece of wood called a distaff, where the clean clump of wool or linen was tied, and a shorter stick weighted at one end with a stone disc called a spindle. The woman pulled a small bundle of fibers from the distaff, attached it to the spindle, and set it spinning in the air, like a suspended top. As the spindle rotated and fell toward the ground, gravity and circular motion twisted the loose fibers together, transforming them into a strong and continuous thread. This technique, known as drop spindle spinning, required a frightening muscular memory. The hands worked on autopilot and never stopped. Spinning was the original multitasking. Women spun while walking to the well to fetch water. They spun while caring for children in the courtyard or while food boiled over the wood fire. They spun while talking with neighbors on the rooftops. It was relentless work, a soft sound of friction that formed the background soundtrack of domestic life. For every single hour someone spent at the loom weaving, approximately 10 hours of spinning were needed to produce the thread. It was an ocean of time. Spinning was so essential to the identity of the virtuous woman in antiquity that ancient proverbs praised her for exactly this. Her hands never let go of the spindle. Without those tireless hands, the ancient world would have walked naked. Thread represented life, patience, and the unshakable dedication of families fighting to keep the cold from their doors. With dozens of kilometers of twisted thread ready, the engineering show could finally begin. And here is where the great secret of the absent scissors reveals itself. If you know anything about modern dressmaking, you know the standard process. Weave a large cloth, draw the pattern, cut the pieces, and sew them together. In the world of Christ, cutting fabric was a financial crime. The solution was brilliant. They did not make the fabric and then cut the clothing. They wove the clothing directly into the shape of the human body. The magical instrument that made this possible was the vertical loom, a giant of wood leaning against the courtyard walls of Jerusalem. Imagine a large wooden frame fixed to the wall. From the top beam, long threads were hung side by side, falling toward the ground. These were called the warp threads. To keep them stretched taut, small clay or stone weights, the size of apples, were tied to the lower ends of those threads. These loom weights are, to this day, among the most common archaeological finds and excavations, proving that almost every home was a small textile workshop. With the vertical threads stretched tight by the weights, the weaver passed the horizontal thread, called the weft, over and under the vertical threads, right to left, and then left to right, to pack the thread tight and make the fabric wind-resistant and strong. A heavy wooden kum was used. The constant sound of the weft being beaten into place was the sound of measured progress echoing through the villages. And how did they make clothing without cutting? Instead of weaving a solid rectangle, the weavers planned the architecture of the garment from the very beginning. When they reached the height where the neck opening would be, they stopped crossing the thread from one side to the other. They began weaving only the left side independently, and then the right side. Then they joined both sides again at the top, weaving across the shoulders. The result was a tunic woven in a single piece, with a perfect neck hole and edges already finished during the weaving, preventing the fabric from fraying. When the piece was taken off the loom, all that was needed was to fold it at the shoulders and close the sides. There was no waste of a single millimeter of thread. It was a technique so calculated we can call it the three-dimensional printer of antiquity. They created the shape and the structure, simultaneously resulting in incredibly durable garments. When speaking of this brilliant weaving technique, it is impossible not to mention one of the most famous pieces of clothing in all of human history, the tunic that Jesus wore on the day he was taken by Roman soldiers. Historical accounts tell us that the guards divided most of his garments into 4 parts, but when they came to the tunic, they stopped. That moment gives us a spectacular and incredibly detailed window into the highest quality textile engineering of the era. Ancient accounts are emphatic in describing the reason for the soldiers' hesitation. The tunic was woven in a single piece, from top to bottom, without a single seam. The soldiers looked at it and decided to cast lots to see who would keep the whole piece. Why would men, accustomed to brutality, suddenly feel such great respect for a piece of cloth? The answer lies in the extreme complexity of making a completely seamless tunic, creating a tubular piece, a perfect closed cylinder of fabric, with precise openings for the arms and head, required masterful technical knowledge. These seamless tunics were woven using the loom in a tubular configuration, where the warp functioned as a continuous circle, the thread crossing from front to back in a complex, geometric dance that fused the front to back of the garment in real time. If a soldier tried to cut that tunic with a knife to divide it, he would be committing an act of vandalism against a work of engineering art. Unlike a modern sewn fabric, a tube-woven tunic would lose all its structural integrity if violated. The thread would begin unraveling uncontrollably. The garment would simply fall apart in their hands. This tunic represented the pinnacle of feminine care and technical skill in the first century. By casting lots for it, the soldiers were competing for a piece of utilitarian luxury, a formidable garment with no friction on the skin, no seams that hurt under the weight of work, and strong enough to last an entire lifetime. The mystery of the tunic is the undeniable proof of the unmatched talent of the craftspeople who lived in the time of Christ. Today, if you want to show the world your status, your profession, or your wealth, you post a photo on social media or wear a shirt with the logo of a famous brand. But in first century Jerusalem, where there were no logos or color tags, how did people know who was wealthy and who was royalty? The answer lay in two crucial elements: the color and the fringes of the garments. Dyeing was the definitive form of ostentation. That is because dyeing fabric with vibrant colors was an expensive, foul-smelling, and absurdly labor-intensive process. The majority of poor people walked the streets in shades of beige, brawn, or gray. They used the natural color of sheep's wool or raw linen. Washing clothes with ash soap helped bleach them, but pure white fabric already indicated someone who could afford launderers. Rich colors were where real power hid. To achieve vibrant red, dyers had to boil the roots of a plant called madder, or crush thousands of tiny insects collected from the branches of oak trees. Imagine the cost and the time to crush enough insects to dye a king's cloak red. The radiant yellow came from saffron, one of the most expensive dyes in the world. The deep blue was extracted from plants through fermentation processes that smelled so bad that dye workshops were legally required to be located outside the city walls. And at the absolute top of the fashion pyramid stood the famous Tyrian purple, that mystical deep violet, the ultimate symbol of royalty. It was made by crushing tiny sea snails found in the Mediterranean Sea. Each snail produced only an almost invisible droplet of dye. Approximately 10,000 rotting mollusks left in the sun were needed to dye the hem of a single cloak. Tyrian purple was worth its weight in gold, and only people of the highest nobility dared to wear it. Beyond the color's clothing was a document of religious identity through fringes. The law of Moses commanded that Jews wear fringes on the four corners of their cloaks, known as sit. It was a physical reminder of the divine commandments. Some high-ranking religious leaders began exaggerating the size of these fringes to demonstrate how superior they were. When you looked at the main square, you saw exactly who was who. The length of the hem, the blue thread in the fringe, and the vividness of the red cloak told the financial and spiritual story of each individual. Throughout this journey behind the scenes of fashion, engineering, and manual labor in antiquity, we clearly see that life in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago was a constant struggle for scarce resources, but also a spectacular display of human creativity, making clothing from scratch without an electric sewing machine. And without large rolls of pre-made fabric was not a sign of technological backwardness. It was the undeniable proof of spectacular practical wisdom and a true science of survival. Clothing in the time of Christ was infinitely more than a superficial accessory to cover nakedness or impress the neighbor. It was, in its purest essence, the first and greatest line of vital defense against an intensely hostile climate. For most people, the wardrobe consisted of two fundamental pieces: the inner tunic, which clung to the body and absorbed the sweat of hard work under the sun, and the outer cloak, the great mantle of rough, thick, heavy wool. The outer cloak was the cornerstone piece of human life. During the hot day, it served as vital protection against the sun's rays and against the sandstorms of Judea. But at night, when the sun went down and the temperature dropped drastically, the cloak took on its most noble function. It was simply everything. The heavy blanket, the invisible roof overhead, and the improvised sleeping bag. Poor people wrapped themselves tightly in their heavy cloaks to survive the intense and terrible cold of the long dark night in the desert. The value of a good thick cloak to basic. Human survival was so enormous that there was a great and important merciful law in the sacred Hebrew texts specifically protecting this item. The law dictated clearly that if a poor man gave his only cloak as debt collateral, the creditor was required to return that cloak before sunset every single day. The sacred scripture itself explains the reason directly. Because it is simply the only blanket that poor man has in the world. What else would he wrap around himself to sleep on the ground and protect himself from the cold? Simple clothing was therefore clearly seen as synonymous with human life itself, blessed and protected by the highest divine tribunal in the universe. In our modern world, when we open overstuffed closets and tell ourselves, with a sigh of frustration, that we have nothing to wear, we are completely disconnected from this heritage of survival. We have simply forgotten the enormous privilege of having a piece of strong, warm fabric resting comfortably on our tired shoulders. In the first century, putting on a hand-woven tunic every morning was wearing on your body an entire history and all the time spent making it. It was wearing forever the endless dedication. Tain BC sacrifice that nobody saw, the countless hours of silent work of devoted mothers, daughters, tireless farmers, and extraordinarily persistent. When you slowly close your eyes now in silence and imagine again those great crowds passionately following Christ through the rocky hills of Galilee, or when you picture the sweating merchants negotiating near the courtyard of the great temple in Jerusalem, I ask you from my heart not to see torn rags or colorless figures. On the contrary, invite you to see the genius and the impressive hidden engineering of the ancient vertical loom working without pause in every single courtyard. Feel the sound of the spindle spinning eternally in the air, marking the rhythm of life. And may you recognize and understand, once and for all, that hidden deep beneath those heavy and incredible folds of those mathematically constructed garments, built without a single cut and without a single seam, beat the strong heart of intelligent people who managed to transform the hardest basic necessity of survival into a true and incomparable work of art, spun, sweated over, and created patiently thread after thread of wool and linen. The wardrobe of the past is not a story of scarcity or absolute misery, but a grand narrative of resilience and triumph. The next time you put on your clothes in the morning, look at the lines of the fabric and remember the silent miracle of history that brought us here today. The modern steel scissors and the sewing machine brought ease and luxury to daily life, but it was the spinning spindle and the agile hands of ancient civilizations that truly taught us what it means to master the supreme art of weaving and embracing our own lives.